This is Breakpoint This Week, a weekly briefing on faith, culture, worldview, and mission with John Stonestreet, president of the Colson Center for Christian Worldview.
Welcome to Breakpoint This Week. I'm here with John Stonestreet to talk about the stories of the week from a Christian worldview perspective. I'm Shane Morris. John, for a while I was, starting to complain that everything we had to talk about on this show this year was COVID-19. It was COVID-19 all the time, wall to wall. And that's still a major story, but man, have the headlines been just crammed with other stuff lately. The big story this week, I think we need to start out with talking about is the Supreme Court's decision in Bostock versus Clayton County.
Yeah, and look, this is as big of a ground shift or as big of a decision as Obergefell was. It really is. Obergefell made this one probably inevitable, this ruling in which the Civil Rights Act, at least Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, being expanded the way that Neil Gorsuch and the majority of the court did to include sexual orientation and gender identity. I mean, this is inevitable, but it's going to open up a whole new world of possibilities, particularly when it comes to the rest of the acts in the civil, or the rest of the titles, in the Civil Rights Act.
So for those who don't know, what happened was in a 6-3 vote, the Supreme Court ruled that Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, which was passed all the way back in 1964 and prohibited discrimination in employment on the basis of sex and race and so forth, also includes sexual orientation and gender identity. So this is just an earth-shattering decision, and it's not being treated as such because it's so technical. It's not like gay marriage is legal like it was in Obergefell. This is something that's a technical shift. But what it does is inserts SOGI categories, sexual orientation, gender identity, into the Civil Rights Act, which effectively does what liberal legislators have been trying to do in Congress for over a decade now. Right,
through the Equality Act. In fact, on Thursday, Nancy Pelosi actually tried to run through the Equality Act through the legislature, and it failed.
Well, it's done. We might as well just pass it now.
Well, I'm not even sure it's necessary. I mean, the question is going to be, based on this argument, which Neil Gorsuch made, which we need to get into, it's going to be impossible now to think about all the areas of life and culture that the Civil Rights Act touched. And essentially, it was an attempt to say that you couldn't keep African Americans out of any part of American life and society. Right. They had the same access. They had to be able to have the same experience and, in employment and education, and so on. I think the next domino to fall, in fact, this will come out in a commentary, Breakpoint commentary early next week. I think the next domino to fall will be Title IX, and that affects education, specifically sex-specific opportunities, including team sports, facilities, and things like that. And we've already seen people try to get at Title IX on a number of levels to expand the definition of sex in the language of Title IX to include SOGI categories. But there's going to be no way really logically, and I'm not saying, by the way, Neil Gorsuch's opinion was logical, but based on what he has now established, there's no way logically to keep it out of Title IX or the rest.
I don't know if this is too mean, but I think that Justice Scalia might have called it jiggery pokery, which is the phrase he used to describe the legal reasoning in Obergefell. But, Associate Justice Samuel Alito's dissent was really just an amazing piece of, legal criticism. And he lists all the different areas of law that are going to be inevitably affected by the logic that Justice Gorsuch used in this case. He says that it's going to have knock-on effects on bathrooms and schools and women's sports and housing and employment by religious organizations and healthcare and even freedom of speech. And the reason for that is simple, John. It's that in law, we have now introduced an argument that equates SOGI categories with race. And we don't tolerate discrimination on the basis of race or sex. But once we have equated these three categories rather, the dominoes are going to fall. Like you said, there is no sound legal basis to hold those dominoes back.
There's not. And he did it in a strange sort of way. And this is why some of us, had nightmares of, Justice Kennedy way of arguing these things. Justice Kennedy got what he wanted in the law. And I'm not saying it's a bad motivation. I mean, I think he was wrong in how he argued Obergefell, and even what he said in earlier laws about, the the right to pursue one's own sense of meaning and all kinds of things that he put in previous decisions. In other words, he got to where he wanted by completely making stuff up, right? I mean, Kennedy just invented things out of thin air, things that had nothing to do with the Constitution. In fact, you might remember John Roberts responded to Justice Kennedy's decision in Obergefell by saying, look, if you wanted same-sex marriage today, then you should celebrate, but don't celebrate the Constitution because this had nothing to do with the Constitution, right? Now, in a strange sort of way, what we had Justice Gorsuch doing is getting to where he wanted to get to, not by making things out of thin air, but by making words mean something else. So everyone kind of expected this whole thing to hinge on whether he would say the meaning of the word sex should now mean sexual orientation and gender identity. And the opposite side of that, everyone thought, was no, the question is, what did they mean in 1964 by the word sex? So what he did is...
He tried to go at it without redefining.
Oh, it was a rhetorical jujitsu of the highest order. And I think if this is now the new Kennedy, it's a different approach than Kennedy, but it's the same kind of playing around with the law. So essentially what he tried to do is say, no, of course, in 1964, sexual orientation and gender identity are not the same things as sex. Homosexuality, transgender status are distinct concepts. That's what he actually argued. But then here's what he did. He said, but you can't discriminate against homosexuals or those who are transgender without first discriminating on the basis of sex. So if you would have no problem with a female employee having sex with a man, then you shouldn't have any problem with a male employee having sex with a man. If a female employee can dress in blouses and skirts and high heels and pantyhose, then it's a discrimination against their sex to say that a man can't do the same thing. So it was a rhetorical jujitsu of really an incredible order. The other thing too, Shane, that we need to say, and that's huge, is that there was something that was done, and we had a conversation this week with the defense attorney for Harris Funeral Homes, who was one of the defendants in this case. There were 3 cases that were basically squished together, 2 having to do with employees that were gay, 1 having to do with an employee that was transgender.
We got also the SOGI categories all smashed together in one case.
And look, you and I have talked about this before. The L and the G and the T aren't saying the same things, right? I mean, they disagree fundamentally on almost on a whole lot of things. And I think, look, somebody at some point's got to call out the T activists for essentially hijacking movements they had nothing to do with and riding the coattails to victory. And that certainly is the case here. Because the question of what happened to the plaintiff, the employee of Harris Funeral Home, is a far different question than what happened in terms of these other cases. In fact, what's been revealed is the plaintiff, who the case is named after, right? Bostock or Bostock. What's fascinating about this case is it's becoming clear that he actually wasn't fired because he was gay. His employer knew he was gay. And that was an article that was written this week in the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, which is a stunning thing that basically he actually wasn't wronged on this basis, but his name now will go down in history as advancing this in employee rights.
Yeah. And, to be clear, John, I would say that in many cases, if I were in the position of running a business, I would be very open to the idea of a self-professed gay employee doing work that doesn't directly relate to sexuality. And I understand that many people would probably have a different idea on that. I think what's really dangerous here is the equation that's being made between sexual orientation, gender identity, and race, because that's going to have further implications well beyond employment that doesn't have to do with sex. So,
well, not just employment, right? So, I mean, what this is going to mean when this precedent is used to force these categories into Title IX is then a college can't keep a biologically male athlete off a women's sports team. And they cannot keep a biological male out of women's locker rooms or dormitories if they want to have access to things like federal funds. The court, for the record, has still done plenty to protect religious liberty, okay? The court has also done plenty to protect the religious freedom of religious institutions in particular. So I think where this leads us is we're going to end up with some sort of Utah compromise-ish sort of thing, where religious institutions are protected, but immediately seen as bigots and biases, and so, biased up front. So in other words, we're the new KKK. If you ask me what's the number one thing this is going to change, we've been talking about this, right? If you put civil rights and LGBT rights as equal, then that means people who are opposed to them are also equal. And we've warned that this is where this is going to take. I think this is the outcome. The outcome is now anyone opposed to this revisionist new form of sexual morality will likely be considered social pariahs up front.
We're going to take a quick break. We'll talk more about this when we come back on Breakpoint this week. Stay with us.
We invite you to visit breakpoint.org, and while you're at our website, be sure to browse our online Colson Center store of books and other resources, and you can find links to our social media sites like Facebook and Twitter.
We're back on Breakpoint this week, talking about the stories of the week from a Christian worldview perspective. I'm Shane Morris here with John Stonestreet. Josh Hawley, senator from Missouri, gave, I think, one of the most powerful, just dissections of this decision and the implications for Christians and the conservative legal movement more broadly. And it was just a stunning speech. And he called this decision, Bostock, the end of the conservative legal movement as we know it. And I just want to read an excerpt here from his speech because it was just so powerful. He said, "The bargain has never been explicitly articulated, but religious conservatives know what it is. The bargain is that you go along with the party establishment, you support their policies and priorities, or at least keep your mouth shut about it. And in return, the establishment will put some judges on the bench who supposedly will protect your constitutional rights to freedom of worship, to freedom of exercise." How has that worked out for us? And I think it's a very powerful question, especially in light of the fact that Neil Gorsuch is a Republican appointee, and not just a Republican appointee, but one who was used in a very central way to justify voting for Donald Trump, who is who's a morally problematic figure.
Well, look, I mean, so it brings up two questions. And first of all, I thought Hawley's speech was surgical. I thought it was fantastic. And I thought the most powerful parts about it were not necessarily questioning this, but two other things. First is articulating that social conservatism and kind of political conservatism aren't the same things. And they haven't been the same things for quite some time. And there's strange bedfellows within the Republican Party that make it very difficult to always be consistent in your views. And I think the need to birth a new one, I think Roger Eyre made that claim that this was going to go down in history as the day it all started. And I don't know, if that's the case, but it was a powerful speech. The other thing that I thought was really great, it was that here you have the legislative branch at least speaking out against the judicial branch in this sort of strong way. I got an email this week and just somebody really discouraged saying, look, why do these rogue judges get to determine everything? And of course, we've been saying that for years, and primarily when we thought we had a leftist sort of court. I think what we have is a politically right sort of court, but a socially left sort of court, right? I mean, John Roberts has demonstrated that he's not willing to die on the hill of social conservatism, and apparently Neil Gorsuch isn't either. And I tweeted this week, I supported Gorsuch and I was wrong, Now, it does bring up two questions. I also tweeted this as a poll, and that's how you come to truth, is you do a Twitter poll. That'll make it all better. But it's like, well, what does this mean? Does this mean it would have been far worse if we were dealing with President Clinton, and not only in the Supreme Court nominees, but certainly all the way down the line across regional courts, district courts, state courts, and all of that sort of thing.
Yeah, and I think that's fair.
It's a fair question, and would it have been worse? And then the second thing, or is the case that we have put far too much weight into what the president can do to change things? Mm-hmm. Because if you look at what Neil Gorsuch did in his opinion, and you contrast that with Justice Alito's dissent, and by the way, even Justice Kavanaugh's dissent, I don't think that has gotten quite the read that it should have. He called out some really, really important things in the methodology that Gorsuch used, and I think that are worth looking at. But look, have we put too much weight in the court to kind of advance this? If there's one thing that Gorsuch's opinion proves to me, it's that law is downstream from culture. I mean, this would, as one of my friends, Brian Mattson, put on Twitter this week, culture is driving this train. And I think law is part of culture. I think sometimes law leads culture. I was just having this conversation yesterday. I mean, like how it's a culturally normal thing to buckle your seatbelt. And that's like 10 years old. It was not like that yesterday. And the thing that changed it was the law and a whole lot of, political or ad campaigns. But when you talk about something like what we're dealing with, the culture's way out ahead on this one. And I think that's what, Josh Hawley was really calling us to. And I think it's a legitimate thing. At least we can say maybe it would have been far worse under President Clinton. And I would say that specifically across the board and the administrative part of the state. But I do think the branches of government are supposed to keep each other accountable. And thank Josh Hawley for being a legislator, calling out the judiciary, saying this isn't your job to legislate from the bench. And this is what exactly happened with Gorsuch's opinion.
Well, as Russell Moore of the Southern Baptist Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission said earlier this week, if this philosophy holds across decisions in the future, what it means is essentially that legislators have no idea what they're enacting when they vote for a new law, because the meaning of words can change at any point in the future. This is another chapter in the judicial tyranny that conservatives have been complaining about for ages. But what makes it particularly a bitter chapter, John, is that this is an ostensibly conservative appointee. This was someone who was supposed to rule in a way that was, originalist or textualist or whatever buzzword you want to use. And we still have the law being redefined and updated from the court here. So I think one of Hawley's best points was that we can't look to the court to save us culturally. It's not going to happen. The court keeps handing, whether it's the Supreme Court or the federal judiciary as a whole, keep handing the progressive left cultural victories here. So,
and can I say something here, Shane?
Somewhere else.
Yeah,
sure.
I mean, let me say something here about the originalism and textualism, because a lot has been made about that when it comes to Gorsuch's opinion. He tried to do the textualist thing. He tried to do an originalist thing. And I think that maybe reveals one of the problems, right? Textualism is a necessary but not a sufficient ingredient in and of itself to give you judicial conservatism. I mean, yes, you need to be a textualist. You need to say, hey, the meaning of words matter, but then you need to have a frame of reference that is able to define words according to common sense, according to reality. And it was this, I think we've talked so much when it comes to the difference between conservative judges and liberal judges that the whole thing boils down to, well, what do the words mean? And this is actually what Kavanaugh's dissent actually brought out, is that a real conservatism doesn't do this kind of textual literalism. It does a common sense reading of the text and takes the text seriously from the common usage, not this kind of strict literal usage. I mean, there was some parsing that Gorsuch did in his opinion that was, I mean, at one level you're like, well, that's impressive, man. I didn't expect that. But what you're bringing out here is just the exact opposite of what the civil rights intended. Right. So the authorial intent was nowhere to be found, in his opinion. And
as Alito said, if you'd taken a poll in the mid 1960s of all Americans, which is, the common understanding of these concepts is what we try to articulate in law. And if you'd taken a poll of Americans in, 64, 65, as to whether sex includes sexual orientation, being gay, lesbian, or your gender identity, most of them probably would have said, no, it doesn't mean being gay. And then they would have, for the gender identity, they would have said, huh? What's that?
Yeah, that's right. So, I mean, listen, 2009, when Chuck Colson and Timothy George and Robbie George put together the Manhattan Declaration, that was 2009. And the transgender moment was nowhere in anyone's purview at that point. Like, no one was thinking, I mean, you knew people who dressed across genders, but the idea that then we would say something like biological sex is a social construct, or, I mean, what was the child psychology professor at Duke University during the Prop 108 who said that genitalia, chromosomes, hormones, and reproductive organs are not reliable scientific means of determining sex or gender. And you hear that and you think, what else do you say? I mean, we have untethered from reality itself.
So in light of this untethering from reality, the question that we have to deal with as Christians is what's next? So we have, a debate going on right now about what the future looks like politically and judicially. How do we move forward? How do we construct a sort of conservative philosophy of of the Constitution and judges who will uphold that philosophy. But then on the other hand, John, we like to emphasize at the Colson Center here that cultural work is, if anything, more important than the political work, and the stuff that's upstream from what happens in politics, because all of this stuff is led by culture. So we had this really interesting article. We want to take a quick break here. We're going to talk about this article by Kevin DeYoung at the Gospel Coalition after we come back. Stay with us.
You can learn more about Breakpoint and the Colson Center for Christian Worldview when you visit breakpoint.org. That's breakpoint.org.
We're back on Breakpoint this week talking about the stories of the week from a Christian worldview perspective. And John, I wanted to lead this segment with just an interesting article by Kevin DeYoung, a pastor writing at the Gospel Coalition. He says it's time for a new culture war strategy. And the strategy is have more children and disciple them like crazy. And here's a passage from what he says. Do you want to rebel against the status quo? And he's saying all this in light of the Supreme Court decision. Do you want people to ask you for a reason for the hope that's in you? Citing 1 Peter 3:15. Then tote your brood of children through Target. There is almost nothing more countercultural than having more children. And once we have those children, there's almost nothing more important than catechizing them in the faith, developing their moral framework, and preparing them to be deeply compassionate lovers of God and lovers of people and relentlessly biblical lovers of truth. And to that, I say amen. But to that, many Twitter users did not say amen.
No, they didn't. Before we get there, let me just say that the fact that this is controversial says a whole lot more about the church than about anything that Kevin DeYoung, said or wrote. So during our Truth Love Together event, Andy Crouch did a wonderful talk about the patient ferment of the early church, which is a book title, which I love. I keep going back and thinking about that. But one of the things he said is that the early church, you can't find, this kind of structured teaching around evangelism, right? But you do find it around patience, because that was so countercultural. Now, we could say that evangelism wasn't important in the early church, but I think that's probably not true at all, right? I think it was very important. But the point probably was more...
Most of the New Testament is written by this guy named Paul, who was pretty good at evangelism.
Yeah, he did it sometimes. So, but my point is that to say that you had to do something, I think the early church would say, of course we're telling everybody about this, because, this whole you preach the gospel and when necessary use words. It would be like, no, what are you talking about? This is a message that Jesus is the Messiah to all the Jews and that Jesus is king to all the Romans, right? I mean, there's a message to proclaim, and it was the defining mark of their movement. I think the same thing when I see this, that the reaction on Twitter that this is somehow controversial.
The family. Or neglecting the gospel.
Well, let's get into the specifics here in just a second, because that's when it gets even more bizarre. But just the fact that you'd have to say this, I think, in generations past, this is what we missed. That until yesterday, you wouldn't have to teach this, because this is observable. What you should do is get married, have some babies, and raise them up in the nurture and admonition of the Lord. And this is one of the ways that the kingdom goes forward. In fact, even more, ways the kingdom goes forward. And this isn't a slam against single people. It wouldn't have been seen as a slam. It would just been observable, obvious, taken for granted truth. Right. But, leave it to Twitter to disagree with that.
It sounds like something Martin Luther would say. He was one of the most pro-family writers in the history of the church, and actually kicked against some of the anti-family biases of his time. And yet the criticism DeYoung received here from, I guess, a more left-leaning Christian set of Twitter was just, criticism like what we just talked about, that this is idolizing the family, putting it ahead of the gospel, that it's not considerate of couples who are infertile or single people, who can't have kids, and it doesn't, one even said it didn't mention adoption or something. I don't know that many of these critics actually even read the piece, because he explicitly says, I'm not saying anything about single people. I'm not saying anything about those who are infertile. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about those who have the ability as Christian couples to maybe have an extra kid, maybe have 2 extra kids, to stretch themselves, to go beyond the cultural expectations and really invest in the future by affirming the goodness of life and family and discipleship of, the little children, bringing them to Jesus, as he said to the disciples. That shouldn't be controversial, but for some reason it is now.
Well, the argument is that, first of all, not everyone is married or can be married, and not everyone can have children.
And we can talk about other issues related to that because the marriage rate in this country is abysmally low right now, and that's a cultural phenomenon in and of itself.
Right. I mean, but if you look at, okay, what's the thing causing more trouble right now for the Christian witness? Is it the fact that the church emphasizes healthy marriages and healthy parents too much? This reminds me of one time I was speaking and someone about how Christian teenagers needed to know why they believe what they believe and be able to understand other worldviews and defend their faith before they go to college. And somebody in the audience said, I think the problem is that youth groups have been too intellectual. And I was like, man, please take me to that youth group, because I have never seen that youth group ever. And here's the same thing. It's like, really, what has caused more damage? Has it been that the church idolizes marriage and family, or that the church has completely embraced no-fault divorce and is too scared to say anything about it, or the church has completely embraced contraception without any sort of kind of even moral conversation ahead of time about this, not to mention abortifacient contraception, which actually ends a human life, or the idea that there is no inherent connection between marriage and children, or that the church has really embraced this idea that marriage is about companionship and personal happiness. And so that should determine if and when and how you have children. And if you choose an intentionally, now let me note this carefully, an intentionally childless marriage, then that's completely okay. And, the church fathers and scripture and theology and God had nothing to say. I mean, what's more of a problem, that we emphasize this, or that too many, husbands and fathers are addicted to porn? In other words, are we really responding to the challenge of the sexual revolution that well, that you can say we've elevated and are idolizing family, marriage and family? Or are we just, at the altar of Molech here, barely hanging on, and we're accused of being too... I want to be more patient, because I do know that there are a lot of 20-something young women in particular who want to be married and they want to have children, and they feel left out when you hear articles like this because they are trying. And so I want to acknowledge that. But their desire to be married and have children and not being able to get there is not the fault of a church that idolizes marriage. It's the fault of a culture that turns young men into adolescents. That's the real problem.
And if we don't figure this out, John, if we don't understand how to return to a central vision of the family, of fertility, of the goodness of children, and of investing in the future through bringing the next generation into existence and prioritizing that, then all the Supreme Court justices in the world that are, strict textualists are not going to redeem this culture. We actually have to participate ourselves by bringing this next generation into existence and discipling them. And none of that is any sort of knock on, going out and converting our neighbors who are not Christians, who are adults or whatever. None of that is a knock on that. It's an acknowledgement of the fact that we're only going to live for so many decades. Yeah. At the end of that, what are we going to leave behind for this world? Is there going to be...
Yeah, look, the only thing I disagree with, and I don't disagree, the only thing I would correct on Kevin DeYoung's piece, which I thought was really good, and we'll link to it at breakpoint.org, is he called this a strategy. This is like calling gravity a strategy, right? In other words, let's use gravity to our advantage. It's not really a strategy. It's just part, and I know what he was trying to do. He was trying to go back to the basics, like, and like Roger saying, look, before we go out there and try to fight a culture war, we might want to actually raise some culture warriors. We might actually want to. And so I'm not quibbling with it at all. But I think we need to start talking about this stuff as if it's gravity, not as if it's a strategy. It's not like, hey, we haven't tried having kids in a while. Let's try it. It's, let's raise a new generation of people who can engage the brokenness of our culture by embracing what is true about life in the world, including marriage. And now that we've got a legal opposition that has such strong headwinds, this is after years of a cultural opposition with strong headwinds. We got to go back to basics. And I'm kind of gutted here that we're out of time to talk about one guy who's brought a really cool strategy around this reality to the issue of fatherlessness. If you come to our podcast,
we're going to have a breakpoint commentary about this week. Yeah.
We are. And let's talk about it here on the podcast edition too.
For our second segment, we've got a really great conversation, or a piece of one, that I want to share with you. This is from my half-hour interview with Natasha Crane, author of Talking with Your Kids About God and Talking with Your Kids About Jesus. And we discuss the paralyzing feeling that we often have as parents of trying to disciple our young children into the faith and be consistent about it. We also talk about what you do as a parent when your kid drops a bombshell on you, when a young child challenges your family's beliefs, and what it often really shows and what's often really behind that. I really enjoyed this chat, and I think you will too. Today, I'm joined by speaker, author, and blogger Natasha Crane. She's the author of Keeping Your Kids on God's Side, 40 Conversations to Help Them Build a Lasting Faith, and Talking with Your Kids About God, 30 Conversations Every Christian Parent Must Have. She's just released a new book for parents entitled Talking with Your Kids About Jesus, 30 Conversations Every Christian Parent Must Have. And I want to talk about both of these outstanding books today. Natasha, thanks so much for joining me on the podcast.
Hey, thanks so much for having me. It's great to talk with you.
Well, you open Talking with Your Kids About God and Talking with Your Kids About Jesus with two really helpful metaphors that I think kind of illustrate the plight that every parent finds themselves in. In the first, you describe how your backyard is the place where plants go to die. And this is due to lack of consistent watering and fertilizing and, the sun over drying them and so forth. And then you say how when it comes time to, when you realize how bad the plants are doing, you go in and just overwater them and flood them, and it kills them. It's like an all or nothing approach. And then in Talking with Your Kids About Jesus, you describe the frustration that every parent knows of seeing how tidy other people's houses appear to be. And we fall into this error of thinking that, well, they must just have better behaved kids, or that maybe their parents are super cleaners. And so we do the same thing to our houses that we do to our plants. We overdo it in these bursts of fevered cleaning. But you say this isn't how clean houses are made. It's not how healthy plants are made. And it's also not how well-informed Christian children are raised. How did you come to that realization? And why is it so liberating? Because I found it truly liberating.
Well, that's great to hear. And yeah, let me just use the analogy from Talking with Your Kids About Jesus and expand on that a little bit. I came across this article on Facebook one day when I was just scrolling, like a lot of us do. I'm just sitting there, and I have always struggled with having a messy house. And I saw this article called 5 Things That Tidy People Don't Do. And so I immediately knew I have to click on this article. So I went into it, and the basic point that I took away from it was this point that said, tidy people don't act like a slob all day and then expect that at the end of the day they're going to clean everything up in one fell swoop. Instead, tidy people develop these small, non-drastic habits of cleaning a little bit at a time, always as they go. And the article called it low-grade tidying. And to me, that was this giant realization that, yes, in terms of my house cleaning, that could really be helpful. But I also saw in terms of discipleship how relevant that is, because we do get so overwhelmed as parents thinking, okay, I'm going to sit down with a book like the one we're talking about right now, or any other book, and we're going to just really go through it with the kids, and it's going to be this giant project. Maybe we need a week-long retreat with the family or something, but that's so overwhelming. So just like with cleaning, how that doesn't really work, I think we can think of this as low-grade tidying in our homes, spiritually speaking, that these conversations that we need to have with our kids need to happen just as an ongoing way of life. It shouldn't be something that we see as this is a sit down all the time, but rather we're working this in as we go all the time. And it truly becomes just a way of parenting rather than a one-time approach or an event.
You said in a conversation with Jim Daly on the Focus on the Family broadcast that children are more like investments than purchases, that they're something that we build into and invest in year after year after year in anticipation of the final outcome, not something that we can just, plonk down a little bit of commitment to or a little bit of time to and then expect some immediate return out of. Talk to us a little bit more about that change of mindset. And then, we spoke about how it's liberating, but I really get this feeling that this is something that will cause parents to breathe a sigh of relief if they truly understand it.
Yeah, this is something that was freeing to me to realize, because I think that a lot of us approach parenting with what I would call a purchase mentality, that we're going to put in X and Y and then Z is going to happen. And if we don't see Z happen per our expectations, then that means that we failed somehow or that our kids have failed. And when we have those expectations, it will lead to resentment. It will lead to frustration, because every parent knows that no matter how great you do, there are still going to be things that happen with your kids that you're like, wait a second, how did this happen? You know, sometimes I think of it as my kids copy 80% of the bad things I do and 20% of the good. I think that's just a general life principle when it comes to parenting. But what changed for me in my mentality, and was so freeing, was when I realized that's not what the Bible calls us to. The Bible's not calling us to this purchase kind of mentality where we're ultimately responsible for our kids' relationship with Jesus. Rather, we're called to make the investment, that we are to talk about truth when we lie down, when we walk along the road, when we sit down, when we get up, you know, the whole Deuteronomy 6 model there. And this is an ongoing way of life, an investment that we're pouring into our kids, but ultimately their relationship with the Lord is between them and God. And so I think when we start to detach the outcome specifically from judging our efforts, we start to have that liberating sense of, okay, God is sovereign. I'm going to be obedient, and I'm going to teach my kids as I should. I'm going to pour into them and invest in them, but ultimately that outcome will be between them and God.
So walk us through how a typical conversation with your kids should go. And we're going to get into a couple of the examples here in the book, but give us the basic outline. What does it look like when your child approaches you with a question or an objection or something like that? And then what is the right response to that?
Well, that could be a lot of different things, because it would depend on the context and the specific question that they're asking. But maybe a couple of things that would help parents to get thinking about this is, number one, if you have no idea how to answer it, because I think that that's the first thing that comes to parents' minds, like, yeah, I don't even know how to approach the answer myself. How will I pass this on? It's great to first acknowledge, hey, this is a great question that you've asked. I'm really glad that you asked it. I'm not really sure the best way to answer that question. So let's look for an answer together. And it's going to be a good opportunity for us to look at good ways to go about finding answers to things and not so good ways. Because of course, what do you think kids are going to do today if they want an answer? They're going to go onto Google, right? And they're not necessarily going to find the best answers, the most informative, fact-based answers there. So if you don't know the answer to a question that comes up, it is far, far better to acknowledge that and use it as a teaching opportunity than to offer an answer that maybe is inaccurate, because that can actually set them up for some misunderstandings that later snowball into something much bigger. So I always encourage parents, it's better to say, I'm not sure, let's find out, rather than the opposite of giving an answer that's incorrect. Now, if you do know the answer, it's also a very good practice to start by asking your kids some questions, because I think sometimes when a child asks a question, we think that we know what they mean, and we start answering something and going into it, and then we realize, wait a second, maybe that's not actually it. So for example, if a child asks something like, how do I know that God exists? Maybe if you've looked at some of this evidence for God's existence before, it's tempting to start going down the road of, well, let's talk about the Kalam cosmological argument and all this stuff. But if you just slow yourself down and you take a second to ask some questions like, well, what's brought that to your mind today? This is such a good question. I'm just curious, what got you thinking about this? Maybe the child answers, well, I've been praying about something and it didn't happen. So how do I know that God's actually there? Those would be very different conversations. And if you had gone about talking about the fine-tuning of the universe, you are a universe away from what they're actually talking about. So taking the time to ask those questions then would lead you to figure out, okay, this is more conversation about prayer. What does the Bible say about prayer? What does it not say? And so in both of those examples, I think whether you don't know the answer or you do know the answer, digging in a little bit more to understand what's really going on behind the question is key.
It's like you're doing a little bit of detective work there to find that underlying question that they're really asking. And then there's a difference, too, that you bring up between questions and just sort of statements or objections that your kids will sometimes throw out. And we have to be careful in the same way with these as well, because they may be saying something that you don't think that they're initially saying. So, for instance, you tell a story about, was it your son or your daughter who said that they hate God?
My son. I was just thinking of that.
My son said something very similar not too long ago. He actually said, I don't believe in God. He's 5 years old. And after I sort of, probed a little bit, it came out that he was just very angry at something that had happened earlier, and he wanted to get a rise out of me and his mother. And the response is going to look a little bit different to that. And then he came back to me later and he said, I don't really believe that. I do believe in God. I was just, trying to make you guys angry. Not in so many words, but in his 5-year-old way. So how do we respond to that sort of thing? So it's not a question. It's more of a statement, sometimes in order to get a rise out of you.
That is a great question, because that is so true, especially as your kids get older. So I have 11-year-old twins and I have a 9-year-old. And the older they get, the closer they get to becoming teenagers, the more they do want to get a rise out of you. And so sometimes they're just dropping bombs at you to just see what you'll say. And a couple of things that I found helpful. Number one, my kids know what I do in terms of writing books and ministry. So they know that if they really want to get under my skin, then they can challenge me on something, related to faith. And so I come to expect that. And number one, I don't want to ever seem shocked by it. So if my daughter is going to, come to me, or my son's going to come to me and say, like, I don't want to go to church, I hate church, whatever the case may be, I'm going to complain about church. We'll use that as an example. I'm not going to be shocked about it.
We've had that one.
Okay. I think every parent has had that one, especially,
right.
Watching online church and stuff right now with the quarantine. I know, I've been there. But when they say that, don't be shocked by it. Don't overreact, because the more that we overreact, the more that it registers in your kid's mind. I've got something now. This is important to mom and dad. I can always hang this over their head. So I don't overreact. And I also recognize that a lot of times this is about a mood. This can be something that's just specific to that day. If your kid's in a bad mood, they're going to complain about everything. They're going to want to get you upset about things. And so if it's one of those kinds of days and I'm sensing that that's what's going on, then I'll just say something like, I'm sorry that you feel that way. If you want to talk about it later, and this is something that is honestly on your mind and you're not just feeling upset right now, I'd love to talk about it. Obviously, right now is not the time. Timing is everything with parenting. And I think especially so when we come to having these conversations about faith matters. But if you really get the sense that they're starting to have questions, and then when they drop off these comments, they're trying to let you know that, they're having a lot of doubts and whatnot, find the right time. And maybe that's at nighttime. Maybe it is before school, whatever it is, whatever is most comfortable for you as a family, and just say, hey, you mentioned earlier about this, I'm just curious, do you really feel like that? And just to kind of, again, ask those questions to get into it. So I think I just break that down into 2 parts. That number one, if they're dropping off a comment just because they want to get under your skin, don't overreact, and make sure that you kind of talk later if you think that's a thing. But if they're dropping it off and you feel like that's something that you need to talk about, then ask more questions at another time.
That was a segment from my longer conversation with author Natasha Crane, whose books Talking with Your Kids About God and Talking with Your Kids About Jesus have been an immense help for me and my family, and who also features as one of the speakers in our Truth, Love Together virtual event. So be sure to catch the rest of my conversation with Natasha on the Breakpoint podcast.
We're back on Breakpoint this week with the extended online edition, talking about one of the other stories of this week, John, that was just so beautiful and so cool. And we talk about a lot of negative stuff on the program because that's just what the news throws at us. But it's worth talking about something that's really positive and beautiful. This guy named Rob Kinney went viral recently as the internet's dad for helping young adults with their do-it-yourself projects, with their fix-its, with their basic tasks around the house. 56-year-old created the popular YouTube channel Dad, How Do I? To share instructional videos for solving common household problems like unclogging drains and changing tires and tying a tie for kids who don't have a dad or a father figure and have never learned how to do these things. And then just the incredible part about this, John, is that in just a few weeks, his channel has accumulated over 2 million subscribers,
Hey, listen,
over 2 million media attention.
Is there another person that you know of that in 2 months had 2 million subscribers on the YouTube channel who wasn't a celebrity to start with?
I don't know. I think most of the people who've had that kind of meteoric rise on YouTube have done something really, really stupid to get it.
Yeah, not 2 million views. Let's correct this. 2 million subscribers. I mean, look, this is one of the most incredible things that I've seen. And it was so simple. I've got a Breakpoint commentary that came out on Friday about this guy. And I said, what he's doing here is what my buddy in Tennessee would not call rocket surgery, right? I mean, it's how to tie a tie, how to change a tire, how to hang a shelf. And the comments are heartbreaking and heartwarming all at the same time, right? because people are literally telling him, you're the dad I never had. I'm learning from you what I should have learned from my dad and I didn't. And they're talking about how I'm proud of you is something that he says. And they've never heard that in their life.
When he gets finished telling them how to, unclog a drain or mount a shelf on the wall or something, he says, well, that's it for today. We'll be back for another project tomorrow. I'm proud of you.
I mean, can you imagine somebody who's never heard that in their life? And they're getting it. And somebody said, you've just unknowingly adopted the entire internet.
And exposed America's vast father wound.
Well, it has. And he himself had that father wound. That's how he got the idea. But, it also goes to this, to underscore this point that what dads do. Years ago on Breakpoint This Week, when it was an interview-based program on the weekends, I interviewed a guy named, I think, Paul Rayburn, who just did enormous amounts of research as a secular humanist evolutionist about whether fathers mattered. And I asked him why, and eventually he said, well, because I have 5 kids and I wanted to know if I mattered. And that's what he actually told me. And as a, somebody who believes the entire universe doesn't ultimately matter, as a secular humanist evolutionist, he wanted to know if his daddying mattered. And this isn't about, well, it is, because it's not about Christians. It's about these things that God in his common grace gave the entire world. And sexual diversity is one of those things. And the expression of that sexual diversity and moms being moms and dads being dads, or as, Ryan Anderson likes to say, there's no such thing as parents, there's moms and dads. This is a remarkable thing. How much is missing in a person's heart and life if a dad's not there? Now, look, I tell students all the time, that doesn't mean you're destined for failure at any level, because there are people who have moms and dads at home who are idiots, and there are people who don't have dads or moms at home that are unbelievable. But a lot of times it has to do with a remarkable single parent doing more than what they signed up for and what anybody should be expected to do. And God, in His grace,
this guy is proof of that.
He is, isn't he?
He's not the father of all these people on YouTube, but he is fathering them. He is giving them that example and that instruction and that affirmation that so many of them didn't have. And we can do the same thing. I mean, his model is infinitely reproducible.
Yeah, that's right. Because you don't have to have a channel. That idea has already been taken. You can, but you can do that for the person next door. Shane, when I saw this story first, that's exactly what I thought. And I work a lot with conservative Christian families and homeschool. We're Christian school settings, and all of us are really, really concerned about what's happening.
Appreciate you getting through that without making a single joke about me being homeschooled.
Well, yeah, that's right. Well, as one who's part of that community, we all are concerned about the dangers to our kids' hearts and souls that this culture is part of this culture and living in this culture. And so there's so many that think the number one job that they have is to keep their family safe from the bad families in the neighborhood. I just wonder if, I always go back to, what's the guy's name? Frederick Buechner, who said that the place God calls you is the place where your deep passion and the world's deep hunger meet. The world's deep hunger right now is dads. And when you have a dad and when you are a dad, and it's not going perfectly, because that never happens, but when it's going well, it's something that you enjoy so much. I just wonder if this is a calling for the Christian community right now, to Christian men in particular. Go be dads to the fatherless. If you have a healthy family, invite unhealthy families into your life.
And it's relevant to so much of what we're seeing culturally right now. I think more so than we even realize, or we will realize within a couple of generations. So much of what's wrong with critical theory, which we talked about this week on Breakpoint, we talked about last week on this program, is that it neglects to take seriously the very real power of family dynamics, of personal and sexual decisions to shape people's lives and to privilege them in certain ways. And it's unbelievable, the statistical privilege you get, the advantage you get in life by just having a dad, by just having married parents. You gave a great illustration of this. I think it was last week, where the Link Year organization did a video where they lined up a bunch of students and they said, okay, you're going to race for $100 bill. And then they said, but before we race, we're going to have those of you who meet these criteria and take 2 steps forward. And they listed off a bunch of different criteria. And one of them was, you have a dad at home who has loved you and been part of your life. And by the time they were done listing off all these things, a group of students was within feet of the finish line. and the rest of the kids were just stuck back at the starting line. And it was a vivid illustration, I think, of how powerful fatherhood in particular, among other things, is to give us an advantage in life. And we should look at that, John, and we should say, not, well, this is unfair, nobody should have this advantage. We should look at that and say, everyone should have this advantage, and we should work our hardest to make sure they do.
Well, and wasn't that the concern we all had with the response to Kevin DeYoung's article? Is that so many of the responses are people going, well, that's not my situation, so let's denigrate. And no, everybody needs that advantage, and it's just an example of that. But yeah, it's a real wonderful video. We'll link to that. By the way, you got to check out this channel. It's again, Dad, How Do I? We'll link to it at breakpoint.org, and to the Breakpoint commentary about Rob Kinney and this kind of unexpected, huge viral success on YouTube that's blessing the socks off of a lot of people who need it. It's just really a wonderful thing.
John, I want to continue here with a couple of the questions, as has become traditional over the last few weeks. We've got questions from listeners, readers, and they're great questions. So we want to tackle a couple of them here. The first one is, it just has to do with so much of what we talk about here on the program with bioethics and end-of-life decisions. And I'll just go ahead and read this, and I've cut it for length. This person is confused by all the variables involved in dying. They say, I'm starting to question the things we do as the human race to prevent death. And it got me thinking about where the line is drawn, or if there is a hard, fast line. What about extreme sports? What about withholding or refusing care to someone who's terminally ill? How is that different from medical aid in dying, like euthanasia? I had a distressing discussion with a woman studying to become a palliative care nurse. She thought it would be kinder to let them all die quickly. When is it just fighting for another breath? What's the difference between refusing treatment for a deadly disease and asking the doctor to help end your suffering? And are we playing God? Okay.
Yeah, that's all. That's what an easy one. Now, I tell you what the question reveals is a couple things. Number one is that when you have lost as a culture the meaning of life, it's going to be really hard to grasp the meaning of death. And that's what we have seen. And a couple weeks ago in one of our short courses, Dr. Ben Mitchell introduced me to a book that I'm currently reading about this very topic. And it's really a remarkable book called The Christian Art of Dying. It used to be that Christian theologians spent a lot of time on what it means to die, because death was such, not only a part of life, it still is a part of life, but it was so in your face. You didn't go, for example, today we think that a good death is one that goes quickly so we don't suffer. But, just yesterday, before the onset of medicine and pain medication and everything else, a good death was one that you could have with your family, loved ones surrounding you, because you did it at home. And a bad death was one in which nobody could say goodbye. I mean, that's changed just in the onset of modern medicine. So modern medicine has brought good things to the table, and it's also confused things. The other thing is because we're so shaped by this modern fear of death that we have forgotten kind of the Christian worldview, which is, death is not the enemy anymore. Suffering is not the all-out, thing we're trying to avoid. We think that there is no redemption at all in suffering. The story of the world is that redemption came through suffering. And that most people who suffer, and I point you to my friend Johnny Erickson Tata, who, in her wonderful talk during our Truth Love Together event, there are things that you get from suffering that you can't get anywhere else. But we are a culture that avoids suffering at all costs. So we've just got so many things back to front. We've got so many things, confused. So I want to point our listener to two different sources. The first is that book, The Christian Art of Dying, which walks through this history. It's a dense book. It's heady, but it will at least bring up the ways we need to rethink that. Clearly, the reader here is rethinking it, and God bless them, because these are hard questions, and it's good to wrestle with this now. The other thing has to do with quite specific questions. The other resource I want to point to is specific questions like, what about withholding or refusing care, and how is that different from medical aid and dying? The philosopher that's written well on this is a Valparaiso University Catholic writer named Gilbert Melander. Mileandr, if you're trying to spell it. That'll get you close enough for Amazon. Gilbert Melander. And he's written a wonderful book. I don't agree with everything in the book. I think he fumbles on a couple areas, but the book is called Bioethics, a Primer for Christians. And again, we'll link to all these. But the most helpful part of that book, and again, I don't agree with the way he fleshes out all these things, but in Bioethics, a Primer for Christians, he talks about the importance of intent, right? When someone administers medication to die, to someone that in order to kill them, that is a different thing than someone withholding treatment to allow death to happen.
Right.
On the flip side, when you keep somebody alive perpetually, which we now can do, we can keep hearts beating that no longer beat, we can keep lungs breathing that no longer breathe, and we can do it without brain activity and brainstem, and we don't even know. But if, let's say, we do it in order so we can salvage their organs, now suddenly we turn a body into a utilitarian factory of saving other lives, right? Yeah. And the question of intent is the one that is so problematic. And so Melander does a great job. So go to those two books, Christian Art of Dying, and I can't remember the author's name, but we'll link to it at breakpoint.org, and Bioethics, a Primer for Christians by Gil Melander.
I would add that what you'll find as you read up on this stuff, study this stuff, and start applying Christian ethics to all the complicated situations that modern technology, modern medicine has created, is that it's not, you're not going to find a situation by situation set of commands, right? You're not going to find a set of directives on how precisely to navigate every situation. What you're going to find is a set of moral principles that you can then apply to these situations. Principles like, it's always wrong to intentionally take an innocent life, or that intent matters, or that life is given by God. It's not given by us, and it shouldn't be taken by us, or that death is not the end. The death is not something to ultimately be feared or fought off indefinitely, because we serve the one who conquered death. That means that we can die with confidence, and we can let our loved ones go at God's timing, with confidence and faith, knowing that death doesn't have the last word. So all of those things will apply to this situation. It's not going to be a set of rules. It's going to be much more like applying the wisdom of the ages to these tough questions.
Oh, there's no way to imagine all the things that we're now able to do medically, right? I mean, if you think about it, not to stretch this hermeneutical principle too much, but do you remember that there was a time where God separated the world into nations because of humans' common ability? Now, you could look at the Tower of Babel and see it as a story of judgment, and I think there's some judgment in there. But there's also a story of mercy. I mean, when God separates the tongues and creates all these nations, he says, let's do this. Otherwise, speaking one language, there's nothing that will be impossible for them. I mean, first of all, that is an unbelievable divine endorsement of human capacity. And second, after the fall, and I don't know if you've learned this personally, Shane, but you should, you ought not do everything that comes into your mind, right? So that's the principle that
I didn't actually know that. I did everything that came into my mind until I had kids, and then I saw it work out in front of me and all the disastrous results, and I stopped.
Well, this is what God literally says. Like, as a people together, we should not do everything that comes into our minds. So what is now the common language? What is the thing now that it kind of is bridging back the language gaps? It's science and medical technology. It's Google Translate, and it's CRISPR technology, and so on. So when you put all that together, we're now on the verge of literally doing almost anything that comes to our mind. I remember when people are like, oh, computers, they'll never be that smart. Do you know how many times a day you actually talk to a robot instead of a real human, right? It is not just, it is ubiquitous. It is so much more normal than it was 3 years ago. I mean, do you know what we're able to do through computer technology? I mean, Elon Musk is considered a visionary, but almost everything, and a transhumanist, but almost everything that he imagines we'll be able to do. That doesn't mean we should do it. It just means we will be able to do it. And so you've got to have those principles, like you said, in place, because there's no ethics manual. There was no ethics manual for the 20th century. Do you think there's going to be one for the 21st century? No way. So we got to be clear on Christian worldview to be able to navigate the waters.
Amen. John, we got another question this week that was really interesting, and I wanted to talk about this. Listener says, I was wondering if future generations are headed more toward monogamy. Is that the new sexual revolution that's kind of coming down the pike? I've read a lot of writers saying it is, and this is what I would prefer, especially for my children. In my experience, anything outside of monogamy causes problems and puts people through pain, including the children and the couple. And to that, obviously, I say amen. But the question is, can we expect a change in the future?
Yeah.
Is there a monogamous shift coming?
Well, the questioner said, in my experience, this is what happens. And I would say, yeah, it's your experience, like gravity is our experience. Again, it's not just, well, my experience has been different. It's literally, this is baked into humanity, into the world as we have it. And so that's why we have it. There have been people kind of contemplating whether the sexual revolution has reached a point of exhaustion. And there's certainly signs of that, right? So the Me Too movement, we can't have the sexual revolution as we always had it. I think there's, the real fight between the T's and the L's that we talk about so much. I mean, this has reached when the sexual revolution reaches an absurd level, it's kind of like when the French Revolution hit a certain point and they were sacrificing to the God of reason after saying they didn't believe in God, but they literally, there's just a nonsensical place that revolutions like this get to.
And brokenness eventually breaks those who practice it. You can't keep denying reality forever and not eventually be either destroyed or chastened.
That's St. Augustine. St. Augustine used this phrase about sin, incurvatus in sin, which is basically sin curves in on itself. And I can give you the grossest illustration of this, having grown up on a farm, if you want it, which my dad had horned Hereford cattle. And horned Hereford cattle, actually, you would actually, if you live out in Texas, you don't have to worry about how their horns. This is where you get longhorns, right? And there's also part of the breed.
And the Watusis. And I know the difference between them, by the way.
Well, but you don't have to control their horns because you don't have fences. But out east, where I grew up, like you were trying to lead them through, and their horns had to be controlled. Now he would just cut them all off and pull them at the beginning, but some breeders would actually put weights on them so that they would, their horns would grow down. Now I'm telling you, this is the dumbest illustration you've heard or your money back, right? But you had to guard those weights because it was possible to actually curve the horn so much that the horn would keep growing and grow back into their brain and kill it.
Ooh,
that is St. Augustine's.
Like Babirusa. Look up photos of the Babirusa pig.
Well, this is St. Augustine. This is what St. Augustine said sin does, and that's what the sexual revolution, it curves in on itself. I mean, it promised women freedom and gave them slavery, right? There's so much here to say. People will go down a long road of ridiculous before reality hits. That's just the way that we are, especially when it comes to sexual pleasure. So I think what some people are pointing to as evidence of monogamy is really evidence of something else. Like, for example, we see that the teen pregnancy rate is down, and people are like, isn't this great?
Yeah.
And less teenagers are having sex. And it's like, isn't that great? Yeah, but 80% of them it's worse than you think. Like 80% of them are hooked on porn. So they're not having sex, but they're also not having any relationships, right? We don't want teenagers
divorce
to have
is way
sex.
down, but
and marriage
is way down.
Well, that's it. I mean, it's too much trouble to bet a woman, right? So in other words, the thought of marrying a woman, are you kidding me? So in other words, the sexual freedom, having freedom in our relationships has killed relationships.
Yeah.
That's the great irony. That's the incurvatus in sin. That's the sin curves in on itself.
I think what we're going to see before then, and this will be the bellwether of the turning of the tide, I think. And I do expect there to be a turning of the tide eventually. I don't know that we have enough evidence to say that it's in the near future, but the bellwether of that will be when you see refugees of the sexual revolution flooding in. I forget who came up with that phrase. Was it
Jennifer Roback Morris talks about victims of the sexual revolution. Yeah.
Right. And she thinks that there's going to be this, and I agree with it, there's going to be this wave of refugees, people who have just been destroyed and broken and hurt and burned out on the sexual revolution and its lies, looking for something better, looking for something that will fulfill them. And I think the dominant culture is going to lag well behind that wave of refugees, but the church has to be ready to receive them, to give them something more substantive, to teach them what it looks like to live in a way that's going to be fulfilling and it's going to actually be in accord with their deepest design.
Yeah.
Augustine said that our hearts are restless until they find their rest in you, referring to God. And that's the kind of rest that we need to be willing and ready to offer people.
Yeah. I mean, look, if it's going to happen, it's going to be the children, because the children are the perpetual victims of the sexual revolution. We choose adult happiness and then lie to ourselves and say the kids will be fine. That's been the whole story of the sexual revolution since the beginning to the end.
Kids are not all right.
Well, they're not. But the question is, what does it mean that they're not all right? Right? I mean, does it mean that they're going to choose monogamy, like they want to do it differently? I think some will, and I think we'll see some really cool stories about that. Or is it going to be they're so scared of marriage and serious relationship that they choose digital virtual ones instead because, hey, it's easier and nobody gets hurt?
Well, I'll add one more thing here. generations aren't some kind of weather pattern. They're not some sort of event that just happens cosmically to us and we can only observe. They're a reality to which we contribute. We're in there, right? As Rich Mullins said, the world that I live in is partly of my own making. This is something that I'm doing. And when we do what Kevin DeYoung was talking about earlier, when we get married, have kids, raise them in the nurture and admonition of the Lord, and send them out into the world, we're making a difference. I mean, statistically, if you look at it, there have been a lot of controversy on this, but the stats are pretty clear that you have an excellent chance, probably a majority chance, or a better than none, better than not. That's what I mean, of your kids retaining the faith that you raised them in. I mean, that's just the reality. And if you raise them that way, they're going to have an impact, however small, on the culture, but that impact is cumulative over, millions of families. You can make a difference. This isn't something that just happens to us.
Yeah, that's right. Agreed.
Well, that's all we can get to today, John. Thanks for your questions, folks, and please keep sending them. We love talking about them here. We love unpacking these issues, and there's a lot of stuff that we don't think to talk about. So we want to hear from you. We want to answer some of these. Head over to breakpoint.org for links to all the stories and articles and videos and podcasts we mentioned today on the program. And you'll also find new material every single day to help you think and live Christianly. For the Colson Center and for John Stonestreet, I'm Shane Morris. Thanks for listening.